Welcome back. You're watching Australian Agenda, and we're joined now by West Australian Senator and Assistant Shadow Treasurer Matthias Cormann, and welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Now, two of your portfolio areas include financial services and superannuation, so we'll get to some of those as well. But tweet of the week, Wayne Swan, that's in your policy area. I mean, at the end of the day, would Labor be better off if they didn't have him?
Well, it's a funny tweet because it's so true. I mean, the reality is Wayne Swan has made a mess of things as Treasurer. He's made a mess of the budget. He's made a mess of the mining tax. And of course, whenever he makes a mess of things, he then goes and scrambles to cover up the costly consequences of his incompetence.
But one thing I agree with him on, though, is his complaints about the opposition's costings not being as apparent as they could be. Are we going to get more at this election than at the last election, where you just had a firm that ended up with a professional misconduct finding against it, just taking a quick squeeze at the numbers?
Well, unlike the Labor Party and unlike the Gillard government, we will go through a methodical, professional, disciplined and structured process. We've been meeting under the leadership of Joe Hockey as a shadow expenditure review committee for a number of years now, going through the budget line by line, identifying Labor waste opportunities for some genuine savings. And of course, we don't take any lessons and lectures here from the Labor Party. We will continue to sort of just focus on the job at hand. We've already had a significant number of policies costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. We will have a further series of policies go to the Parliamentary Budget Office in the near future.
But I guess what I'm asking is, do you acknowledge that you need to do a better job of the costings than at the last election?
People in the lead up to the next election will have all of the information in front of them. We will have all of our policies properly costed, properly funded. But of course, it would be quite irresponsible for us to finalise that work now while we haven't got in front of us all of the necessary information. In the lead up just before Christmas, the Treasurer, of course, said that all of the data that was released previously in the budget and in the mid-year economic fiscal outlook was out of date. We need to know what the true position of the budget is going to be by the time we finalise the prioritisation of our policies and so on.
Well, the budget will be only 4 months before the election, so after the May budget is brought down, presumably you're then in a position to know what the financial situation of the Commonwealth is and then release your policies. Is that the situation?
Well, it is not the situation. I mean, certainly when the budget comes down, we'll have a clearer indication as to what Wayne Swan says the situation is at that point in time. But if you look at his past track record, there's always been a lot of fudging and cooking of the books going on. We, of course, will be looking forward to the pre-election economic and fiscal outlook, which has to be released by Treasury and the Finance Department after the election has been called, because only that gives us a true indication of where things are at. And finally, on that point, if you look at recent budgets, from budget time, very quickly the budget position deteriorated. If you look at the last financial year, 2011-12, in the lead up to the last election in August 2010, we were told the deficit would be $10 billion. By the time of the final budget outcome 2 years later, the deficit was $43.7 billion.
Surely it's too late, though, to wait until the fiscal release during the campaign. That comes 10 days into the campaign. If voters are going to be left till then there's no serious scrutiny that's going to be allowed of the opposition's costings approach.
Well, as I've said, we've gone through a methodical process for some time now, and like where things are at right now, based on the official figures that were released in the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, we are confident that we will be able to deliver a budget surplus from year one and over the forward estimates. But of course, we don't know what the current position of the budget is, because, I mean, Wayne Swan has said the government will not deliver a surplus this financial year, even though they've promised on about 200 occasions that they would, before we can make final judgments, both in terms of the policy priorities and also the structure of our costings and so on. We need to know what the true position of the budget is.
Okay, so what you're effectively telling us is that the opposition won't be releasing its detailed costed policies until after that pre-election financial statement.
Well, there's nothing unusual about that. In good time before the next election, after we know what the true position of the budget is, based on advice from the Treasury Secretary and the Secretary of the Finance Department, and not Wayne Swan, who hasn't got a very good track record.
Well, you come under massive heat. I mean, you'll come under massive heat to release policies before then.
But we will stick to our timetable.
You'll stick to the timetable.
We will not be distracted.
Okay, so you won't succumb to that pressure at all?
Well, I mean, it is the responsible thing to do. I mean, if we've got to make judgments on what is achievable, what can be done in the context of the position of the budget at the time as we go into the next election. For us to make judgments and final decisions without having a key piece of information would be quite irresponsible, quite reckless, and that is not how we do things.
Do you expect that if the opposition wins and Tony Abbott becomes Prime Minister, that if he's able to repeal the carbon tax but gets blocked in the Senate on the mining tax, particularly as a West Australian senator, are you expecting that you will have a double dissolution election on that mining tax to get rid of it?
Well, I just can't imagine that the Labor Party after the next election would want to keep a tax in place which is complex, which is costly to administer, which is costly to comply with. The ITO has spent $50 million and more so far to administer the MRRT. Smaller miners have spent more than $20 million so far administering it, yet it hasn't raised any meaningful revenue. I can't imagine that the Labor Party after the next election would be as belligerent as the Treasurer is now to try and keep in place a tax which is bad for an important industry in Australia and which is not raising any meaningful revenue.
You see, I can see them buckling on the carbon tax because that'll be a focal point of the election, but the mining tax I think that they think plays out differently. If they do, if I'm right and you're wrong on that, and they do stick to their guns on it, are you expecting a double dissolution election? Because that is what Tony Abbott is committed to.
I mean, that is a hypothetical question. Let's cross that bridge when we get there. I mean, as far as we're concerned, our commitment is very clear. We will scrap the carbon tax because it's a bad tax for Australia. It's not in our national interest. It is a tax that pushes up the cost of living, pushes up the cost of doing business, makes us less competitive internationally without doing anything to help reduce emissions, and we will scrap the mining tax because it's bad for investment in a very important sector of our economy.
I'd like to ask whether we're facing a political war on superannuation policy in the election year. Now, while we don't know what the government will do, the government has sent a number of signals indicating that they intend to take decisions to significantly crack down on the tax concessions in relation to superannuation. So just looking at it in terms of principle, can we be fairly certain the coalition will oppose what Labor does?
Well, absolutely. Let's be very clear. The Labor Party wants to increase taxes on people who are saving to achieve a self-funded retirement, on people who are doing the right thing by saving more so they can look after their own retirement needs and not be a burden on the public purse. I mean, this is a government that clearly is desperate for more cash. They've spent $172 billion more in their first 4 budgets than they've raised in revenue. They've already made $120 billion worth of promises that are unfunded. So they're casting around for more cash, and there's $1.34 trillion worth of retirement savings of Australians, and this Labor government wants a share of it.
Okay, now if we just look at what they say, drawing upon the Henry tax review, is that a lot of these tax concessions accrue very much to high-income earners, and clearly we don't know where they'll draw the line, but they will present this as a fairness and equity issue. You are still prepared to fight it?
Well, I mean, the Labor Party is, cherry-picking out of the Henry tax review because the Henry tax review recommended against the increase in compulsory super from 9 to 12%, but Labor pressed ahead with it anyway. But, Paul, there's no doubt that the Labor Party will pursue a political strategy, will pursue political spin and propaganda to brand those Australians who are saving to look after their own retirement needs as somehow a group of people that are quasi-rorting the system, that are benefiting from some perks that they don't deserve. But let's just be very clear what superannuation is all about. Superannuation is about taxing income that goes into super at 15%, which is lower than your marginal tax rate if you take them as take-home pay, because you agree to lock that money up until you retire so that it's available for you in retirement to fund your retirement needs. Now, I mean, this is not a perk. This is not something inappropriate that a bunch of rich and wealthy people are able to benefit from. This is a very deliberate incentive to encourage as many Australians as possible to save more voluntarily so they can look after their own retirement
I'd just like
needs.
to ask you, in terms of principle here, Does the coalition think that the 15% tax on the way in should be maintained and not increased? Is that essentially your position? And do you think that super on the way out in terms of the exit should remain tax-free?
That is exactly what we've said. We've said that in the first term of a coalition government, we will not make any unexpected negative changes to superannuation. And let me just talk about, on the way out. If you had to put your money into a bank account, and you would receive interest on it along the way, and you pay a particular tax rate, whichever the applicable tax rate is along the way. If you take that money out of your bank account, you don't pay any tax on the way out. Why should the situation be different when you put your money into super? I mean, when you put your money into super, the difference is that you can't take it out for a 20, 30, 40-year period to make sure that, one, it grows because of the investment returns along the way, and two, that you have it available in retirement.
Well, do you think that what I said at the start is correct, that we are going to see a political war over superannuation policy?
Well, I mean, Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan have been pursuing a class war across so many areas. Wayne Swan is a treasurer that manifestly doesn't like success. He doesn't like successful people. He doesn't like aspiration. Whatever changes they've made over the last 4 or 5 years have invariably targeted aspirational Australians, people that are working hard, trying to get a better life for themselves and for their children. And so, yes, I mean, the short answer is yes, I do expect that the Labor Party will try and run a class war in the context of superannuation. That's not good for Australia, and it's certainly not good for people who are doing the right thing by saving for their retirement.
Senator, Western Australia is disproportionately represented in the Liberal Party,
I don't think so.
Courtesy of electoral success for the Liberal Party out of WA. My question is this. Your state Liberal government there is up in arms about the way that the GST siphons out of its state to subsidise other states. When will West Australian Liberals, and I get asked this all the time by West Australian Liberals at state level in WA, when will West Australian Liberals federally stand up and get a commitment to put a base limit on WA's share of GST revenue?
Look, I mean, Colin Barnett, as our Premier, is a very forceful advocate for the interests of our state, and, obviously I look forward to him being successful.
Why aren't West Australians in the federal level as forceful as he is?
Obviously, those of us who are in the federal parliament, as well as representing Western Australia, need to take a national perspective. We aspire to be the next national government. Having said that, there are clearly issues with the GST sharing arrangements. We ought to make sure that the GST sharing arrangements are fair and transparent. I mean, these are obviously discussions that we will continue to have internally, and when we have something to announce in the lead up to the next election, we will do so. But in the meantime, the current government has commissioned a review into the GST sharing arrangements, and it's high time for them to tell us what it is that they're planning to do with it.
But Nick Greiner, as part of the review, made it clear that he doesn't think that there should be a base limit of around 70 or 75 cents in the dollar, as Colin Barnett and Christian Porter, who's moving federally, have both talked about. What's your view as a senior West Australian Liberal? Would you like to see a coalition government put a base limit of somewhere around that 70, 75 cents?
Well, my view is that the GST sharing arrangements need to be fair and transparent, and of course we'll continue to have conversations inside our party room as to how that can best be done. Obviously, all of us from different parts of Australia represent the different perspectives of our different communities, and of course ultimately we've got to come together to with a national consensus.
But you must have an opinion on it as a West Australian, a senior West Australian Liberal, about that base limit, and you're about to be joined by another person that's made a pretty clear statement about their opinion on it, Christian Porter. When he was Treasurer, he's moving into the federal party.
Sure, and my job is to argue for what I think the right way forward is within the processes of our party.
But you haven't told us what the right way forward is, so can I ask, do you accept that the current distribution of the GST revenue is not an adequate basis, that it needs to be reassessed and reviewed in principle? Do you agree with that?
Well, we've been on the record as saying that there are clearly some issues for states like Western Australia with the current GST sharing arrangements.
Well, how do you fix that in government?
Well, and that is a very good question, but you've got to fix it in a way that is obviously sustainable, that is based on involvement and consultation with all of the relevant stakeholders, which includes, of course, states and territories right across Australia. And once we will have something to say about this in good time before the next election.
Before the election?
Well, that is what we've said before.
Might you do a new review?
Well, I mean, I don't know that there is a need for a new review at this stage, but like, I don't want to rule anything out or rule anything.
But there's something in train by the sounds of it.
Well,
it's just that you're going to hold the announcement back.
Well, clearly there has been an ongoing discussion for some time now in relation to this issue.
OK, one final question before we let you go, Senator. There's reports today in the Sunday Times newspaper out of Perth about Stephen Smith having an interest in going into state politics if Labor loses the next state election there to lead the party rather than end up in a long term of opposition federally if Tony Abbott wins the next election. Have you heard any rumours around Perth about Stephen Smith looking to move into state politics?
Well, I saw those reports. There were similar reports last year. It sounds like Stephen Smith has been having conversations with one of the key right faction power brokers in Western Australia about shifting into WA state politics to take over as leader of the state Labor Party from Mark McGowan should he lose the next election. Look, I think that clearly Stephen Smith needs to clarify what he's asked Joe Bullock to do to help him shift into state politics in WA, and he needs to clarify whether it is his intention to join Chris Evans and Nicola Roxon in cutting and running from the shambles that are the Gillard government.
All right, Senator Matthias Cormann, we'll let you go. We appreciate you joining us in the studio on Australian Agenda. Thanks for your company.
Good to be here.
We're going to take a